Hey, in this lesson, we're going to make our list content interactive. So it initially loads it from the JSON data and it stores that within the local storage. So that's going to make it persistent whenever we refresh the page. Any changes that we've made are going to stay consistent. And we're also going to be adding and removing the classes by making the elements interactive and making them clickable. And one other thing that we need to make sure within this lesson is that we have a consistent local data that's going to be consistent with the data that we're saving and that the user is able to see. So whenever we make any updates to any of the items on the page, we want to make sure that the statuses change as well within the local storage so that we're saving the data properly, so whenever the user refreshes the page and they've made updates to the list, they can still see their list content available. So that's what we're doing in this lesson, making it more dynamic and interactive. In the last lesson, we set up a JSON file and we loaded the data into the web application that we're constructing. So in this lesson, we want to make it more interactive so that we can toggle and add the confirmed off and on, and also keep a basic global object of the list so that we can store it to local storage. So this is going to be our list object. I'm going to use let, and I'll just call it my list. So we'll start out by just creating a blank object, and actually this is going to be an array. So creating a blank list array. And then as we loop through each one of the list items, then we can add that onto the list array. So taking the list and let's push the element object into it. And then as we make the list, we can update and we'll actually console log and output the my list content. So that gives us a full list of all of the items that are coming from the JSON file. And this also gives us a container that we can use in order to store the contents in there. And I'll also just log out the list as we go through. So we start out by having just one item within the list, and then we go to 2, 3, 4, and ultimately 5 items in the list as we're looping through and we're outputting the list contents. And the other option that we have, and which probably work a little bit better than this, is to take the my list and equal the data into the my list. And then instead of looping through the data, we'll loop through the my list and we don't have to add to the list itself. So that will allow us to update and add the content of the list. And now if we check the my list contents, we see that we have that loaded data. And so now we have an opportunity to load the data into my list, either from the fetch request, or we can load it from the local storage. So we want to make and have an option to save it and load it from the local storage. So let's set that up as well. So we're check to see once the page loads. And we can separate this out into separate functions, which is going to make it a lot easier to call the content. And I'll just create one called maker. And once we've got contents in the list, then we can run through maker. And this is where we can clear out the output of the HTML. Having separate functions to handle all of these will make your code a lot cleaner. Let's also create another one that's going to be local data. And this is actually going to be getting the content from the browser's local storage. So using the local storage, and we'll also set the content in there. So checking the local storage. Let's get the item. And we'll look for an item called my list. So we'll load that. And this is where we can place the conditions. So once the DOM content has loaded, before we make our fetch request, we can check to see if local data, and if it does exist, then we can load it from the local data. Otherwise, we can make a fetch request to update the list contents. So let's set the my list and set it to the local data, and using local storage and get item, and the item that we're getting is the my list. So let's try that, and we should also be setting the list. So once we make a fetch request after we run the maker, let's use the local storage and set item, and we'll set the item my list, and we're going to equal that to the JSON stringified version of the my list data. And as we load it from local, we also need to run through the maker function in order to add the content on the page. And the one problem here is that when we get it from the local storage, the list itself isn't going to be parsed as JSON. So you can add in the JSON parse. It's going to be coming through as a string object. So we want to avoid that, and we want it as a usable JavaScript object. So that's where you can use the JSON parse, and then in order to set it into local storage, we need to stringify the JSON data. So this is going to be an array of data. And at any point as well, you could console log out the my list. So you can see the contents that are there. Also, if you load the local data and you want to see how it's being contained in there, so it's going to be saved as a string value in there. So you see it's the JSON data is all just regular string content that's sitting within there. So now we've got a way to store and set the local storage. We also want to make the list interactive. So let's add the ability to click on the list and set it to status to true or not. So let's select the item information. And as we're making the list, we're also going to send over the index value. So it's going to send both of the element information and the index. And we're going to use the index in order to update the my list data as we're making updates and we're clicking. So we need a way to make that update. So let's, instead of sending it over to make the list, it's going to also add in the index value. And the index value can be a way that we can detect what item needs to be updated in the list. So let's adding in an event listener. So add event listener. The event that we're listening for is a click on the object. So when it gets clicked, we're going to run the function here. So whenever it gets clicked, we're going to toggle these two classes. So let's see if that works. So now we have an option to toggle the classes, and it's not updating the list yet. So the one that we need to update is the my list. So whenever it gets clicked, we'll console log out the list. And so that way we can make sure that we have a consistent, what we've got viewed out on the page is going to be consistent to what we're using within the my list. So that third one right now is true still within the list, but we have to update it still. So we want to make an update to the content, and we want to update the status either to true or to false. So let's add in one more condition, and we'll check to see what the current status is, and then we'll update it accordingly. So we can do a condition if div class list contains, if it contains confirmed, and it will contain confirmed now because we're toggling the confirmed. So if it contains confirmed, so I'll console log out the class list information. So clear the console. So we're tracking and we're seeing that now it's true, and it's true when it's green. So if it is confirmed, then we're going to take the my list using the index value of index, which we're passing in over here within the make list, and we're going to update the status to be true. Otherwise, else, we can update the status to be false. So let's clear our console. So right now, Mary is false. Let's check and make sure that our data is consistent. So we'll set them all to be false. And they're all false. So the one other thing that we need to do when we reload, we're going back to the stored local version. So whenever we make any updates, we need to once again store the list contents. And don't forget to JSON stringify it to store it as a string list. So now whenever we make updates and we refresh the list, it's going to stay consistent with the existing content that's on the page. So go ahead and add the interaction using the classes into your project. And coming up next, we're going to finish and we'll wrap up the project. So that's still to come in the next lesson. Challenge for this lesson is to create global variables that are going to track your current list items. So you're going to need one to track the list current state as well as the local data and set the local data value. Also create and get the local storage value using the local storage, so you can get item and also set item into the local storage. And this only takes a string value, so you have to parse and stringify the JavaScript object from the JSON data in order to output it properly on the page. And also make the list items interactive, so make them clickable. Whenever you click on them, they should toggle the classes. So toggling the confirmed and not confirmed classes. And then you can also use and check to see if the element contains that class and checks to see the status value and updating those status values in the list. So you have to also make sure that the current local mylist is going to be consistent with what the user sees on the screen.